But what was the essential story I was trying to tell in that documentary? What was I really trying to get? Because as you know, with documentaries, you have hundreds of hours of footage interviewing people. But really, what's the thread? What's the theme of the documentary? And so that's how it did help my writing quite a bit.
Story time with Stephanie Storey.
I'm art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time, where I get to talk to other writers about their passions and their processes and their latest projects. My guest today, very excited about talking to her because she's a former filmmaker, so you know we're going to talk about the movies. But she's also a novelist of books like The Tree House, A New Life, and her latest, just out earlier this spring, What We Give, What We Take. Welcome to the show, Randi Triant.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. You have some awesome novels. You've also been a filmmaker, so we have lots to talk about. But before we get to talking about other stuff, tell my viewers at home about your latest novel, What We Give, What We Take, this mother-son story. Tell them what they are in store for.
So the elevator pitch is that it's a mother-son saga about survival. That's the short and sweet of it.
Well, give us a little more than this.
Right.
Give us a little bit longer elevator ride.
The story is about a single mother who's also a water tank escape artist, who is a terrible decision maker, and consequently her son, who's disabled, has to run away.
Right. So she goes off to do a performance, leaves her son at home with abusive dad. And so the son has to run off.
A boyfriend.
Boyfriend, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so and then she tries to go reconnect with him, like tries to reconnect with him.
Right.
Talk to me about why this, like, it feels like a lot of regret to me. It's not like it's like this uplift, like it's a heartbreaker. Like, why did this story appeal to you? Why did you feel like you needed to tell it?
So it goes back a ways. When I was in elementary school, there was another classmate of mine who actually got polio, which is what Dickie Stonewall, my protagonist, has. And this classmate got polio, even though the polio vaccine had been out for many years. And I always wondered, that stuck with me, even as a kid. I always wondered, because it was so unusual, I always wondered how that happened and how that affected his relationship with his parents, if indeed they denied him the polio vaccine. I don't know what happened. I never knew the story, but it stuck with me. And I thought it would be worthwhile to explore how parent decisions are made. And you might think it is the best decision that you've ever made in your life, and it turns out to be the worst decision for that child. So that was part of it. And I did a short story of it when I was getting my MFA at Bennington College, and it was part of my thesis, and a draft went to one of my thesis advisors. And the short story, because it was so small, only focused on Dickie. And so my thesis advisor said to me, okay, the kid's okay. We love the kid, but what about that mother? How could she do this? And then on top of it, she leaves him when he's a teenager and goes to Vietnam to entertain supposedly the troops over in Vietnam, because she is a water tank escape artist. How could she leave her kid like that? So that's what propelled me to write the story. I was really interested in seeing what would happen to Dickie, especially as he got older. And it is a coming of age story, but he's looking back. So the book is told in 3 parts, as you know. The first part is the two of them, they're in Key West, and then all of a sudden his mother, Faye, up and leaves to Vietnam. The second part is told through her viewpoint in Vietnam. And then the third part is he's older, he's 40. It's 25 years later. He has since run away. I don't want to give a spoiler, but he has since run away. He was forced to run away. And now he's in Provincetown, and he ends up on the run and living he's straight, but he's ending up living with a man who is living with AIDS. And it's about whether he can shed his past, Dickie can shed his past and move on. and actually have a life.
You're not a mom. I love writing, but one of the reasons why I write fiction is because I get to write about stuff that I am not. A lot of my protagonists are men. I'm not one. One of the reasons why I write about it is I get to go into that imaginary world. So how did you navigate getting into that imaginary world of being a disabled son, which you're not, and being a mom who abandoned, which you're not? How did you get into that space to write that fiction?
Well, first of all, I felt like I knew Faye because not because of the bad decisions that she makes, but because of her way of just picking herself up after every bad decision. And she realizes it's a bad decision, and she picks herself up and dusts herself off, and she goes on, no matter what hits her. And in the book, I saddled her with a lot. There's a lot that happens to her in Vietnam, especially. It is not the joy trip that she thought the escape that she thought it was going to be at all. And I felt like I could identify with that because my own personality is that no matter what happens to me, I'm going to go on. Somehow I'll go on. And so I was interested in, from my own viewpoint, exploring how that is and where that comes from and that strength. And with Dickie, I just kept imagining what it must be like for him having such a raw deal in life. And he also picks himself up. And I at the very beginning of writing this book, which took me 10 years off and on to write, at the very beginning, I knew I wanted to give him agency. And so I did not want to make him a victim. I wanted him to be kind of the ruler of his own life eventually. And he does things that no teenager should have to do. Runs away, takes care of himself, ends up in one situation in New York City, then ends up finally in Provincetown, really starting from scratch by himself. But Faye taught him all those survival skills. So that's why I say, ultimately, the book is about survival.
Where did you get water tank escape artist?
Well, I love magic. And as a kid, I loved magic. And I read quite a few books about Houdini when I was a kid. And that again, I mean, some of these things you must know, like, how do we write these things? Where do they come from? You sit down, you have a blank page or a blank screen, and you think, oh, I'll write about this. And all of a sudden, Faye becomes something I hadn't intended for her to become. And I love carnivals. Like, I love not to get into filmmaking, but I love the series Carnival. I loved it, and so I put that into the book as well. And I thought, she is somebody who tries to escape everything that happens to her, but here she is in this cylinder of water performing these feats, and yet she can't escape from her own life, which is another theme of the book, basically, that you really can't escape your past. You can get over it, but you can't escape it.
Boy, isn't that true? No, but the reason why I ask those kinds of questions is precisely of what you just said, because I never would have known you were obsessed with magic and carnivals until you had to answer that question. Like, that's not in your bio somewhere. That's not something that comes out, but it just ekes out of the fiction as this odd, fascinating detail that obviously comes from your life. And it's the reason why I like reading fiction, because I find these weird things that come out of people because they're individual people. Okay, speaking of things that have come out of you like that, you've written 3 books so far, 3 novels so far. What are the common threads in what you write? Have you figured it out yet? I always think it takes like a few books before you really know what you're writing about.
Mm-hmm. I have figured it. I think I figured it out until some reviewer will come along and tell me that they saw something else in them. But all 3 of my books are really about loss and learning to live again. Basically, there are elements of different types of loss, and I'm very interested in coping with loss and how people do that, because all of us experience at some point loss and grief. It's one of the few things we all experience. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of us experience happiness, but not everybody. A lot of us experience success, but not everybody. But every single person experiences loss, but we all treat it differently. And so that's really important to me. And I also think from a personal point of view, in my late 20s, I lost my brother to a drowning, a bad boating accident. Then right after that, I lost my father. And then right after that, I lost my best friend to AIDS. So I kind of, in my younger years, was molded by loss. And so I'm very interested in exploring that. I write to explore something I don't understand or that I want to understand better. And so for me, a lot of writing about loss in these books has done that for me.
I was going to ask earlier why, because you write a lot about HIV and AIDS, and you just answered that question because you lost a dear friend when you were young. It was so prominent when I was, I was born in 75, right? So it was so prominent when I was growing up, and it feels like it's receded somehow. And I know it's in part because there are better treatments and people live longer and more effectively with it. But how does it? You're still writing about it. I mean, you're still including it in your novel. How is it still impacting you as a person, and how is AIDS still impacting the way you see the world? Even though I feel like sometimes we backseat it and we don't foreground it anymore. Why is it still important for you to represent in your literature, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think it's still a huge public health issue. Maybe it's taken a backseat here, but it shouldn't. I mean, just in 2019, the last data that's around, over 1 million people in this country, 13 years and older, have HIV. And so for me, it's never gone away. It's still there. And yes, there are drugs, but to take those drugs is a strict regimen, and there's still depression, and there's still a lot of stigma. And so one of the issues, one of the themes I wanted to explore was the stigma around AIDS, because my character Spin, who Dickie ends up living with, he has AIDS and he's dying of it. And so Dickie has a question of, am I going to stay with him and take care of him as a friend, or am I going to leave because I'm on the run and I can't get a connection. I can't have any connections there. So that was important to me. And not just the stigma from straight people, but also the stigma within the AIDS community, the gay community itself is very important to me to keep writing about. I don't think it's an issue that's gone away. It's just that people don't talk about it as much.
That's what I meant. It's been backgrounded in our imagination somehow, even though it's still so prevalent that we need to be talking about it more. So that's why I love that it is one of the themes that you try to foreground more and have us continue to discuss, so that it doesn't get ignored or it's not happening anymore. You said earlier a couple of times that this book took you 10 years to write. Those are my favorite kinds of books, right? I take eons to write books. I churned out television. I will ask about filmmaking in a minute. I churned out 5 nights a week of television for 20 years. I do not want to churn out books. It takes me 180 years to write all of them. I don't care. I love that. I love it that way. Why did your other books take as long to write, and which version do you like better, right? Because this one you conceived of in graduate school, and it sort of comes along and it sounds like it would happen, and then it would go away, and then it would happen again, and then it would go away. Versus did the other books come faster or in one chunk, or did they all take 10 years? What is your process, Randi? That's what I'm asking.
So my process is kind of, it varies, because the first 2 books did not take that long at all. The first 2 books each took, I am a slow writer, so they each took about 3 years. By the time I started it to the time I was done, it was ready for people to see it, get back some feedback and so on. This book just took a long time. And I think it's because, quite frankly, it's much more advanced for me. particular book. I changed within the book, I changed point of view. I have, I span from the 1960s to the 1990s. There's 3 different stories going on that had to parallel each other so that the reader hopefully won't lose interest by the time they get to the 3rd section. So there was a lot that I had to deal with. Plus the research for this book was extensive because I didn't know everything about the Vietnam War. I didn't know everything about the 60s. Polio, I had to research that. I had to research all about her water tank escape act. I had no idea like how they would do it, or how long they would stay underwater, or what she would have to do in order to stay fit for it. So all of that took time. And in the 3rd section, Dickie ends up living, as I said, with a New York City eccentric artist who is very loosely, I did a lot of work with kind of putting in some aspects of different artists into that artist. So all of that took time, especially the Vietnam War. It took a long time.
But see, I'm a historical novelist. Like, I love all that research and then adding it into the story. Like, that's one of my favorite parts. It's why it takes me so freaking long to write them. So do you like that process of embedding real research and real historical research into your stories? Are you going to do that more as you go forward? Or was I think it was too much, I'm backing away?
I think I will do that more because I didn't do that with the first 2 books at all. And I think I will do that because I do enjoy research. I was really fortunate because the clinic that is in Vietnam that Faye ends up at, I wrote to the American Friends Service Committee, and because they ran a similar clinic in Vietnam during the war. And I just wrote to them and said, do you have any information on that particular clinic that you ran in the 60s? And I actually was allowed, they invited me to their central office in Pennsylvania to come in and see their footage and read their diaries from their doctors and their nurses. And they gave me film footage. They were wonderful. So that just kind of turned my mind around research also, because that was phenomenal. It transported me to that time period.
Okay, so when you were a filmmaker, did you make movies? Did you try to tell the same kinds of stories that you tell now? Or has that changed from, has it changed based on your, medium, film versus novels, or has it changed as you aged? What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, I was in public health filmmaking, so it was very different. And also I got into it in a very unconventional way. I had writer's block, and I was working it was the only time in my life I had writer's block. I was writing fiction on the side. I've always written fiction. And I was working for a public health research firm. And at the time, and I had writer's block, and I thought, to break this writer's block, I'm going to sign up for a film class at the Mass College of Art. So I took the film class because I thought if I looked through a viewfinder, that it would change what I saw and that it would break my writer's block. Like if I looked through that viewfinder for the entire semester, I wouldn't be looking all over here. I would be focusing on looking at people. And I loved it. I loved it more than I thought. So my writer's block broke, and I went back to the owners of the public health research firm. And I said, it's great that we're doing all this incredible research for the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And we're getting all this information about diseases and conditions. But wouldn't it be great if we had a media department to do documentaries for patients and also do medical education for the doctors and the nurses? And so they said, great, go ahead and do it if you can find the funding. So I found all this funding for the documentaries. So my work was really on public health issues, and was either documentaries or there were medical education programs. And what that did for my writing was it really honed my writing to kind of figure out what was the essential story. I don't know if you felt this way, but what was the essential story I was trying to tell in that documentary? What was I really trying to get? Because as you know, with documentaries, you have hundreds of hours of footage interviewing people. But really, what's the thread? What's the theme of the documentary? And so that's how it did help my writing quite a bit, getting into that. And then that's how my career went. I just stuck with it.
Right. Well, I mean, you sort of brush off, oh, it wasn't really a filmmaker, it was a public. Yes, you were. You were a public health filmmaker. Like, you're making films, you're telling people stories. I was a talk and news producer primarily. Like, that was my turn in Hollywood. Mainly it was that kind of stuff. Like, it was making news and talking about social issues. So you have clearly always been interested in social issues. If that's where your career starts, you become a filmmaker in that. And that stuff's still showing up in your noveling now, when you can write about anything you want because you control the whole world when you're a novelist.
Right.
What is it about those kinds of issues that drives you as a person, has clearly driven you your entire career? Why has that been so important to you that you're still doing it?
Well, don't you want to learn about the human condition, other people's perspective? I do. I get tired of myself. I don't know how you are, but as a writer, you spend hours by yourself. You have to, and it's great. It's my life. I've always done it. But I love finding out and exploring other people and how they behave, and the whole human condition, the human brain. Like, people react so differently to things, and their lives are so different. And so writing fiction is my way of doing that. I did not have a mother like Faye. My mother was terrific. I loved her, and I had a happy childhood. I was not like Dickie at all. And literally we stayed in one house my entire childhood. So, and Dickie moved around. So for me, it was, what would that be like? So for me to explore that is really what excites me in life. And I wouldn't do it any differently. I don't want to write about myself. John Cheever wrote about suburbia, well, there's nothing to be said. He took it all.
I agree. I don't want to write about me either. I'm so boring.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm like, no, I'm going to write about somebody else. It's more exciting. Okay, Randi, what is next for you? What are you going to continue writing novels, and what kinds of novels are drawing your attention right now? What's next on your agenda?
So I actually have a novel started, but I haven't gotten back to it because of all of this with this new book. But it is actually about two women who were childhood friends and there was a rift, a bad rift, and became estranged. And then one of them becomes ill and calls up the other one out of the blue and says, I need you to come back and take care of me. And so it's their story. So, and they're kind of forced together to go on a road trip, if you will, to find out about different alternative treatments for this person. And so I like to think of it in my head. I don't know if you do this, but in my head, I think of like my proposed books as like, how would I sum this up? And for me, it's Thelma and Louise. They're in the car, but they don't go off the cliff, and they're stuck together, So what happens then when you are estranged from a childhood friend and you're stuck together?
Oh, I love it. And I love it that you're back to, public health in a way. You're back to health issues like that.
I don't think I'll leave that. I think it'll be a tough haul for me to leave health issues or human condition issues. I mean, your common thread is art, right? Art history. So I think we're fortunate that we found what we really love.
That's what I started to say. That's the beauty of it, is what you're passionate about, and what you have stories inside that you really have to get out and tell about this area. And that's going to make all of your writing more in depth and deeper and richer to read, because you've been doing it for so long and you have such a passion for it.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.